Ladies and gentlemen, for those who don't know me, hopefully all of you have seen my name at some point at least, but I am Henry Taylor, Vice President for University Advancement at GGU. I am pleased to be a member of the executive team here at Golden Gate University and am more pleased to be able to introduce our speaker for this evening. I will share a little bit of his bio in a moment, but I have had the privilege of knowing Jeremiah and Rachel Sims since 2010. And in that time, I have found both to be amazing professionals and amazing individuals. They are both not just educated and professionally quite competent, but they genuinely lead with their heart and want to ensure that they are making a difference on all that they encounter and come across. Diversity, equity, and inclusion have become a fundamental part of the work they do. While Jeremiah is not officially a member of the Golden Gate University staff, Rachel Sims is. She serves as Director of Advancement Strategy and Operations in the University Advancement Division, and really is a very key partner in the work we are doing to re-engage, re-energize with our alumni and more broadly the outside world. Golden Gate has a lot to offer, but we clearly need to remind people who we are, because sometimes we are thought of as one of the best kept secrets in San Francisco, and that is not ideally what we want to continue to be. Instead, we want people to know how good we are, the commitment we have made to be at the center of educating working adults since 1901. As this is the last day of Black History Month, I certainly want to bring us to the topic. And right before I do that, I will again just share very briefly a little bit of Dr. Sims' bio. So Jeremiah Sims grew up born in Oakland, but raised in Richmond in the Parchester Village area. And so he has come to understand firsthand the challenges that many, particularly people of color, experience. Jeremiah has made a commitment to not only learning and to sharing what he learns with others, but he brings his faith and his community as key parts of what guides him forward. Jeremiah most recently served as Director of Equity for the College of San Mateo. He is an alum of UC Berkeley, where he earned his bachelor degree in rhetoric with honors, as well as his master's and PhD in education. Jeremiah and Rachel lead a consulting practice called Rooted in Love, and I'm sure Jeremiah will share more about that during his presentation. But ultimately, Jeremiah is here to talk about reclaiming Dr. King's radical legacy. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that is kind of just popular these days. And, regardless of how you see those issues, the reality is Dr. King is certainly a fundamental part of American history. But too often that place in American history enables us to not be as focused on what his legacy not only meant, but more importantly, what it should mean today and what that requires of us as we interact with others in the world. So with that, I am pleased to give the floor to Dr. Jeremiah Sims. I am excited to welcome you to Golden Gate University and to share your insight with all those who are participating and those who will watch this video afterward. So thank you.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Henry. I want to shout out the GGU advancement team, wonderful folks doing incredibly impactful work, necessary work, because this is a capitalist economy. As much as we want to view educational spaces as these altruistic spaces that are going to change people's lives, change people's career trajectories, and they do have opportunities and even a charter to do that, stuff requires money. And so without advancement teams, colleges only go so far. So shout out to you all for understanding that justice is not in word only, but has to be in deed also. And in the capitalist economy, that deed is measured monetarily by and large. All right. So we're going to have a conversation about reclaiming Dr. King's radical legacy. So I'm going to go through these slides. But before we do that, we want to take a poll, because I know that you all, even if you are not from the United States originally, you've heard of Dr. King, more than likely, right? He traveled. He is someone who has been desensitized and defanged in a way that has made him palatable to the masses. And so we know in January, we're going to celebrate his birthday. And in February, he is going to be plastered on classrooms throughout the United States of America. And so he's someone that you should have heard of. If you haven't, this is an introduction to some aspects of his life and work. I welcome you to fully participate in the conversation. So I think we're going to open up the polls first. And so if anyone has difficulty reading it for whatever reason, I'm getting up there. These words are getting smaller and smaller to me. I'll read it out loud. Have you heard of MLK's I Have a Dream speech? Yes, no, or not sure. Have you heard that MLK, or even believe that later MLK said that in many ways his dream has turned into a nightmare? So have at it, folks. And while you're doing that, I'm going to continue to move forward so that I can honor your commitment. And so I want to start by saying this: in California, especially, and places in Washington that have a larger kind of relative indigenous population, it is customary to offer land acknowledgements before conversations, especially conversations that adhere around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness. And I myself am still wrestling with land acknowledgements because I am loath to ever commit myself fully to performative activism or performative allyship, which I think much of DEIB work has been reduced to. And so if my friend Robert Schaffner, if I go to Robert Schaffner's house and I bring some friends with me and I take it over by force, then I say, Robert, you can only occupy this one room that I've reserved for you here, right? This becomes your reservation. And I take and I use everything in his house because I've settled there, right? In this kind of settler colonial move, I've settled there, and I take all the resources from his house, and even the space that I reserved for him. If I want, I'll come take some things out of there too. But yet and still, every morning I wake up and I say, I just want to recognize that this is Robert's house, right? To me, that doesn't work. That's not what real social justice looks like. And so if I'm not giving Robert his land back, and I'm not knocking people that do it, but for me, my commitment to justice is very important to me. And if I'm going to talk about it, and we'll talk about this later, this aspect of radical love, which is called radical integrity. In order for radical integrity to be real, to be made manifest, word and deed have to match. And so for me to come out and acknowledge, I'm just picking on Robert because he's my guy, but for me to acknowledge that it's Robert's house while he's stuck in that room and can't leave, that's not a real acknowledgement of anything, because acknowledgement means that I'm on the way towards a kind of restorative justice. And so most of the time, the land acknowledgements that I've seen have been performative. It's so that people can check a box and then move on with whatever the conversation is. I'm not going to do that here. So I just wanted to explain why that is. And so I'm not surprised by the poll. I know that you all have heard I Had a Dream, right? I don't know if you know that the I Have a Dream speech was actually titled Normalcy Never Again, right? It was a much more radical speech, but it was changed once Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King got to the podium, all right, at the urging of some of his friends. And then have you heard MLK later say that dream has in many ways turned into a nightmare, right? And so so most of you have not, right? And other folks are not sure, but he did in fact say that in 1967 when asked about the dream. He said that very thing. So I'm going to move forward now. So what do you know about Dr. King? Other than I have a dream speech, I'd love to know what you all know. And there's no wrong answers here. We're building a beloved community, right? Your answers are above critique at this point, but I just want to know, right? We know that depending on your age, right, it's likely that you heard conversations around Martin Luther King during February at the very least, and later on in January while you were in school. So what do you know about Dr. King? Let's put some facts in the chat. He was a minister, correct? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, absolutely. Yeah, he was 39 years old when he was assassinated. This is good. So he is not a stranger to you all, right? And so it's really interesting. So I'll tell you, my engagement with Dr. King was I was always interested in Dr. King's work. But my mother, I grew up in a single parent home. My mother was on the fringes of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, right? So the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense came out of a spirit that was post-King, that was interested in more in line with Brother Malcolm X around Black power, because you have to remember that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King never advocated for Black people, right? And I don't want this to be lost. I'm not talking about some kind of color blindness, but Dr. King advocated for the Negro, right? So the Negro in and of itself was a kind of assimilationist positionality, integrationist positionality, right? But the Black power movement, when you think about Brother Malcolm X, who he was oftentimes juxtaposed with, Malcolm X was fighting for Black people, right? So there was a difference there, right? So Malcolm X, they were both saying the same thing, right? They say that you claim that this country is a democracy, which I would push back against in some respects, because in a democracy, what's the primary component of a democracy, right? The people get to determine who they vote for. In this country, you either vote red or blue. You can vote for Bernie Sanders if you want, but he's not going to win, right? And so there's only red or blue in this country. So that's not, by definition, that's not democratic. Now we know that this is a democratic experiment, and both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, even though their approaches were different, were asking the same thing of America: tell the truth about who you are, because until you tell the truth, we can't move forward. All right, thank you all for putting your MLK knowledge. Now, I'm willing to guess that for many of you, if I asked you to say what you know about Malcolm X, there would be fewer things there. Not all of you, but some of you, right? And so, okay, so let's talk about our analytical framing. There's an article that came out recently from the editor-in-chief of a digital magazine called Tablet. Her name is Alana Newhouse. And so I don't agree with the article wholesale, but there are aspects of it that I think are important. In this article, the article is called "Is Everything Broken?" And she talks about these two kind of contradistinctive factions. You have brokenists and you have status quoists, right? So I'll talk a little bit about what those are. So a brokenist is someone who feels that the systems that we have in place are so broken that they're irreparable. They cannot be corrected, right? So we have to radically reimagine the systems and the systematicity that informs and infracts the lived experiences of human beings on this earth. And then there are status quoists, right? Status quoists may acknowledge that there are some issues, but by and large, our systems that are in place are systems that are working well, and they need to be maintained. Now, they may need to be revised, they may need to be contemporized, but they're not, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then we're going to talk about Guy Debord's work. So my training is that of a rhetorician, right? And so even my graduate work, though it was in the School of Education, was in a program called Language, Literacy, and Culture. And so we paid attention to kind of rhetorical meanings and how to derive meaning from how language means, not just what language means. And so Guy Debord's work is integral in that. And he talks about the spectacle. The spectacle is exactly what it sounds like. It's a distraction. Spectacles, work that is invested in catalyzing a spectacle is work that functions as weapons of mass distraction, okay? And then we're going to talk about what characterized Dr. King's work, right? Which I would argue also, we're going to talk about some other folks a little bit too. We'll talk about Malcolm X a little bit. We'll talk about James Baldwin a little bit. All these gentlemen, though they went about their work differently, they were all of their work was predicated on radical love. And so we'll talk about that. So I'll keep moving forward. And I want to just be clear that in the chat is always live. If you ever find yourself in conversation with me and I'm facilitating and leading that conversation, just like you are already doing, right? And we'll get to that. The system is not broken. I see Sandra's comment here, right? It's working the way that it was designed. So keep the chat lit, right? Obviously, I can't do both, but knock yourself out with regard to the chat. All right. So is everything broken? This is Alana Newhouse's work. And so the question is, are our institutionalized systems fundamentally broken? And if so, and so she doesn't really push on this, right? And she's writing from a somewhat privileged positionality, and she admits to this as much. But if they're broken, who are they broken for? So if they're broken the same for everyone, that's one thing, but I would argue they're not. And so building off of Sandra's point, right? The idea is that when things are broken, they're not all broken the same way. We saw that when Hurricane Katrina happened, right? We saw that the systems, the infrastructure in place that was there to protect people was broken, but it wasn't broken in the same way because Black and brown folks bore the brunt of the negative impacts of Hurricane Katrina, and poor people bore the brunt. Or we can look at COVID, right? Who died during COVID? Who lost loved ones during COVID at a disproportionate rate? It was poor, ethno-racially minoritized people of color, right? Those are the people. So the system was broken. We weren't fully prepared to deal with the global pandemic, but it wasn't broken for everyone in the same way. So this idea of brokenness needs to be more nuanced, but I think it will help us think through how we reconcile with the radical legacy of Dr. King, right? And so my question for you all, right, thinking about Dr. King, because we know, so this is something that was driving me nuts in 2020. So, in 2020, we had this so-called racial reckoning, right? Charles M. Blow, and we'll see some quotes from his book later. He had a book called The Devil You Know. And he said that what we saw in 2020 was this gigantic white cosplaying of performative allyship or performative activism, right? Even invoking the idea offered by Derek Bell, who was a legal studies professor, one of the forefathers of critical race theory, when Derek Bell said, my greatest fear is that everything changes and nothing changes, right? And so there are people who would argue, I believe I find myself firmly situated in this camp, that in 2020, what we saw offered in light of the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Tony McDade and Breonna Taylor and so many more, was a kind of response to a kind of white guilt that was percolating up, but was not, there was not enough space to have generative conversations about it. So what happened is that people just offered platitudes, right? You saw this from industry, you saw this from education, you saw revised mission statements, you saw statements of solidarity. All these things came to the fore, right, for different institutions. But here's the kicker, right? Revising a mission statement, that's good. Do that, right? Now you say you stand with Black lives. Writing a statement of solidarity, right? I stand with Black and Latinx lives, right? I will not stand trans antagonism or homophobia, right? Or cis hetero patriarchy, any of these things. But if your budget doesn't match that, you're not telling the truth. If you work for an institution that has a budget, their budget is their mission statement. Their budget is their values and goals, right? It's not enough to say, I stand with Black lives. If you're not allocating resources to improve the condition of Black lives, then you're not really standing on Black lives. And so what we'll talk about when we talk about radical love later on is how radical love is made up of these two primary components. There's radical integrity, which we'll unpack later, and radical humility. Sorry, we'll unpack radical humility later. Radical integrity is simple. Word and deed have to match. There has to be a synchronicity between word and deed for radical integrity to be present, because when word and deed match, the truth is present, right? And for radical integrity to exist, and not only exist, but to thrive, the truth has to be present. But if your mission statement says one thing and your budget says something else, well, we have a problem, because this is a capitalist economy. Resources have to be allocated. And that's what ultimately got Dr. King in trouble. You remember, Dr. King was vilified, right? And he was continuously harassed, right? He said so much so that he had to leave his phone off the hook for hours on end. He couldn't get any phone calls because every time he picked up the phone, it was inward this, a threat here. Even the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover called him repeatedly and encouraged him to commit suicide, right? So his very existence was an act of subversion. And so you have to realize that just saying that we're doing the thing is not the same as doing the thing. So when Dr. King started to talk about, when he was talking about race, folks were like, okay, we don't like this guy. We'd rather he go away. But talking about race is divisive. But when he started to talk about capitalism, or even more specifically, racialized capitalism, that's when he really became public enemy number one. And so we'll talk more about that later. And I know I'm going kind of fast. There's a lot of information coming at you. If questions arise, make sure that you put them in the chat, because we'll have a Q&A opportunity, and then I'll do my best to unpack those there. And if someone else has an answer, please feel free to provide that. And so I want to go back to this idea of a brokenness versus a status quo. What was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King? If you had to, and I'm asking you to do so, if you had to put him in one of those camps, understanding that there's a dynamism there, what camp would you put Dr. King in, right? Because remember, he was an integrationist. So was he a brokenist or was he a status quoist? Just put your answer in the chat, please. And while y'all are doing that, again, to honor y'all's time, I'm gonna keep going. Not that it's not important to unpack that. So what would you say? I see some folks are saying that he's a brokenness, but what would you say to the folks, right? And we saw that I started talking about this and I didn't finish. In 2020, I saw so many people who were, my brothers and sisters, especially my brothers and sisters who are racialized as white, because I would argue this may be salacious for some folks, but there's no such thing as white people, but there are people who have been racialized as white. Right? There are people who have Nordic or Scandinavian or European ancestry, right? People who are Russian or Polish or Ukrainian, but whiteness, because if white existed, you could take me to the nation of white. So if you show me where that is, right? Maybe I can catch a flight, me and Henry will get together and we'll go to white, but there are no white people, right? There are Dutch people, right? There are Finnish people, but there are no white. White isn't a place that you can go to. White is a political categorization that has been used as an othering mechanism. And so for my brothers and sisters who have been racialized as white, I saw them quoting Dr. King ad nauseum. It was like making me sick to my stomach. They were quoting. So when things were going on, when there were these uprisings over racial injustice, what was happening is that people would use part of MLK quote, or riot is the voice of the unheard, or something like that. But they were using Dr. King to quell what they believed to be riotous behavior. It wasn't actually riotous behavior, right? And then people were using Dr. King to talk about how this just came up with the Super Bowl. So you remember in the Super Bowl, you had the Philadelphia Eagles and the Kansas City Chiefs. Both quarterbacks are Black, right? And so I have this morbid fascination with reading commentary on Yahoo and other places sometimes. I'm not as bad as I used to be. I used to get stuck in really dark rabbit holes and responded to I'd be responding to like 100 different comments and telling them how it was anti-Black and all. I just got better stuff to do with my time now. But anyway, somebody said this, right? And I remember this, not knowing I was going to have this talk yet. They said, well, why are you mentioning race? As soon as you mention race, you're being racist. Remember what Dr. King said. These two quarterbacks should only be known by the content of their character. So there was a move to firmly situate Dr. King and his work within the status quoist, right? Within the status quoist positionality. And so then what would y'all say about Brother Malcolm, for those of you who are familiar with his life and work? Where would he fit? Was he a brokenist or was he a status quoist? And it's interesting, when I talk to people about Malcolm X, they often say that they prefer Dr. King because Malcolm X was violent, but there's no violent incident that can be attributed to Malcolm X. Malcolm X for sure had a militancy to him, right? And that scared white people. But he's not, there is no record of him doing anything, outside of his time as Detroit Red, right? Once he became Brother Malcolm X, right? There's no record of him leading any type of violent insurrection or anything like that, right? But people associate him with violence. I don't know if you know this tidbit, but I think it's important to talk about and unpack at some future point that Stan Lee actually built the X-Men around this, right? So Charles Xavier is supposed to be representative of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and Magneto is supposed to be representative of Malcolm X, right? You see that kind of, for those of you who are familiar with X-Men, you see that kind of tension there. All right, so we'll return to this. We'll return to this later. So America's MLK, I saw this, man, I don't have it anymore, but there was a meme where this Republican, and again, I don't care if people are on the right or the left, I'm just stating facts, where a Republican was using Dr. King to speak pejoratively about some of the protests that he was seeing. And then Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter, said, well, no, that's not what my dad meant at all. And the incredulity of this man led him to correct her. His own daughter, who has studied, right? She's a learned person, right? And has studied her own father's work and is responsible for leading the MLK Center. And he said, you misread what your father said, right? That level of incredulity is not everybody's even capable of that, but I just wanted to point that out. So in America's MLK, right, is someone who was status quoist, someone who was a proponent of colorblindness, and someone who felt that even I saw signs that said Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was a staunch Republican, right? He was someone who would have advocated for removing affirmative action, and all these different things have been attributed to him. Again, his work has been co-opted in many spaces, but who was he really, right? Here's some quotes directly from Dr. King, right? That should help us unpack whether or not we feel he fits. And these this brokenist, status quoist is a dichotomy. Obviously, there are places in the middle for people to rest. So Professor Cornel West, when asked, he's a philosophy professor and a professor of theology and one of the foremost thinkers of our time. When asked what a pragmatic philosopher is, he said a pragmatic philosopher, and I think that this is a much better fit for Dr. King, for Malcolm X, for James Baldwin, right? He said a pragmatic philosopher is someone who is trying to build community within catastrophe. So I'm gonna say that one more time. A pragmatic philosopher is someone who is trying to build community, even a beloved community, within catastrophe. And so I think that is a much more apt, right? And it's a continuum, right? But I think that's a much more apt description of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's life and work. So here from his own quotes. Why is equality so assiduously avoided? Let me move this out of my way. Sorry, y'all. I got too many things on my screen. I'm going to let you all read it yourself because now all my apps have popped up because of Zoom. All right. Sorry, friends. The majority of white Americans consider themselves superior, right? And so they're I got to move this stuff out of the way. I'm sorry, y'all. Give me 1 second. I'm stuck. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide and see if I can. Your lovely faces are right in front of the slides, and Zoom is not allowing me to move it. So I'm enjoying your smiles, but I got to figure out how to go to the next slide. Give me 1 second. Actually, now the whole computer stopped. I'm stuck.
So if we were in the same location, I would be helping him right now, but we're not.
Yep. Here we go. All right, now I can do it. The mouse was disappearing. Okay, here we go. Yeah. Why is somebody calling me? Nobody ever calls me until. All right, here we go. The majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth toward a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony. But unfortunately, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity, right? And so the reason why we're talking about Martin Luther King, not just because it's Black history, but we're talking about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King because his life and work can be used as a kind of microcosmic example of social justice work or DEIB work. I know that like many institutions, GGU is invested in creating safe spaces for all of the students that you serve and the people that work and form the community there. So I think it's important to think about how to commit to DEIB work in a way that doesn't replicate performative activism or performative allyship. And I really like this verse. is speaking of John the Baptist. This is Jesus speaking, right? Who I consider to be a pretty credible source. And when he's talking about John the Baptist, this is what he says. It says, "What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses," right? Because this man was in the wilderness. He was on the front lines, this man being John the Baptist. "What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet." I would argue that Martin Luther King's work, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's work, is prophetic. "From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force." And so I think this is a really important point, because what Dr. King was advocating for was a beloved community, right? For him, the beloved community mirrored the kingdom of God. And here it says the kingdom of God is taken by violent men and is taken by force. So how does that reconcile with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach, right? So Martin Luther King, MLK's work was inspired by and largely even mimicked in some ways the work of Mahatma Gandhi, right? And so Gandhi was committed to nonviolence, and there was something that impelled that nonviolence. It was called satyagraha, which is truth force, or sometimes translated love force. And so what Gandhi said about love force or truth force is that it is, while it is physically nonviolent, it is incredibly violent spiritually. And so I would argue that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach adhered exclusively around physical violence. And I'm arguing that Dr. King was clear that his nonviolent approach was incredibly violent or forceful, right? A synonym for violent is forceful spiritually. Because I would argue, and I believe that Dr. King believed, I know that Dr. King believed this to be true, is that we are spiritual beings in human bodies and not the other way around. And so what he was trying to do was impress upon the spirit of people, because remember, he said that the arc of the moral universe eventually will bend towards justice. All right, so reclaiming the radical legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Let's talk about it. So who was he? This was Mark Lamont Hill, right? Today, let us remember Martin Luther King as he was, a Black, radical, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, revolutionary Christian who died as an enemy of the state. Anything else is just a lie. And so we'll talk a little bit about James Baldwin's work later, but in a book, 2020 book by Eddie S. Glaude Jr. called Begin Again, when he looks at the life and work of James Baldwin, one of the primary things that Baldwin was asking of this country was that it tell the truth about who it was, because we have a really selective memory, right? We see a quote from Gore Vidal later. It says that we should call this country the United States of amnesia. But what James Baldwin is arguing is that things like chattel slavery or the genocidal settler colonial violence visited on indigenous people in this country, right, or the anti-Chinese laws of the 1800s, right, or Jim Crow, all these things are bumps on the road towards a more perfect union, right? And so that has become our kind of nationalist meta-narrative. But that is patently false. Those things are not just bumps on the road. They are who we are as a country. And until we're able to reconcile those truths, we're continuing to build on top of a foundation that is built on top of a lie, right? And so the idea is that we need to tell the truth. If we want to be honest about DEIB work, if GGU wants to be fully committed to DEIB work, you have to tell the truth. You have a history that should be applauded, right? GGU has been a college that has invited a diverse student population far longer than it was in vogue to do so, right? But no college that is interested in achieving equity and justice can rest on its laurels, right? So what are you doing now? What does your resource allocation look like, right? What type of monies are being devoted to creating safe spaces for diverse students to be incredibly successful at GGU? Those are the types of questions that you're all going to have to wrestle with. So let's take a look at some of these things about Dr. King. Never forget that Dr. King's opposition to racism, militarism, and capitalism were deemed so radical by the FBI and the US government that white supremacy assassinated him at 39 years old. He was deemed one of the most hated men in America in 1967. Many today would not love him. A reminder how they talked about MLK when he was alive, right? You see this? all this chaos behind them. I plan to lead another nonviolent march tomorrow. And see, that's the thing. There's no right way for people who are advocating for justice and for freedom for themselves to protest. If Colin Kaepernick kneels, right, and there's no perceivable violence there, people have a problem with that. If people march, even though that is foundational to America, right, and this idea of democracy that we want to kind of curate here, it's still a problem. It's not really about the thing. It's about the people doing the thing, and that's what Dr. King was very clear about. Please don't, and this is from Bernice King, please don't act like everyone loved my father. He was assassinated. A 1967 poll reflected that he was one of the most hated men in America. I think he was number 3. Most hated. Many who quote him now and invoke him to deter justice today would likely hate and already may hate the authentic King. Right? So I think that that's something that we need to pay attention to. So social justice work is hard, y'all. Social justice work requires us to, and here's the thing for my brothers and sisters who have been racialized as white. Right. And I wrote about this in this book. We'll talk about this later. This is the White Educator's Guide to Equity. Just came out last week. And there's a quote in here, and it talks about how that's a quote, like I wrote it. It's my quote. But anyway, it talks about how I talk about how white people, folks who have been racialized as white, even folks who are interested in being progressive and seeing equity and justice realized in their lifetime, people who are anti-racist still have to reckon with the fact that there is a system in place that privileges whiteness. So even if folks voted against Trump, or the white folks that voted against Trump, the white folks that voted for Trump, all benefit from the same system that privileges them because of their proximity to whiteness, right? And so that is a conundrum that always has to be unfurled, unpacked, and discussed if we want to work together in solidarity towards a more equitable reality for all of the students that GGU serves. All right, here's another quote from Dr. King. And so I don't know if Lila is on here. Lila is a student at GGU who is a friend of ours, and we had this conversation a while back, and I didn't want to admit that gentrification is a kind of microcosmic example of settler colonialism, because it is, but it's just like, so what? It's not big enough to talk about. But Lila, you were right. Congratulations. You can rub it in my face later. And so I want to talk about this, right? Interrogating the gentrification of a revolutionary Black leader. That is what has happened. But this is Dr. King's words, right? Because remember, he has been invoked to quell kind of racial requests for racial reckoning or demands for racial reckoning. But Dr. King himself said, if peace means a willingness to be exploited economically, dominated politically, humiliated and segregated, I don't want peace. See, that runs in the face of what people are arguing that Dr. King was calling for, right? If peace means being complacently adjusted to a deadening status quo, well, maybe it's not a status quo. I don't want peace. If peace means keeping my mouth shut in the midst of injustice and evil, I don't want it. Peace is not simply the absence of conflict, but the existence of justice for all people. And so I want to be clear about the distinction, because often these two terms are conflated. Equity and justice are not the same thing. Equity is the first step towards justice. So let's take a step back to some of the things that happened in 2020, and I want to give you all a chance to respond in the chat. So when we saw Derek Chauvin suffocate the life out of George Floyd, right, for, was it 8 minutes and 46 seconds or 9 minutes and 46 seconds, some inordinate amount of time, where he murdered him on live television. Now, he was convicted for that. And so my question to you all, and I want you to respond in the chat, when Derek Chauvin was convicted, and I believe sentenced to 22 years for the murder of George Floyd, is that justice? So please answer in the chat, y'all. That's my question. I'm gonna take a sip of water while y'all. Was that justice? And you can put whatever you want, but I'm looking for some yeses and some nos. So I see a lot of no's here. And so the idea is that the justice system had its say, right? And so I think that the justice system would argue that justice was served. But here's the thing. I don't think that was justice, right? Somebody put what I was going to say. That's accountability. Accountability is a baseline requirement for any civil society. You have to have accountability. But justice would be different. Justice would mean that we wouldn't sit with bated breath to listen to see whether or not he was convicted of a crime that we all saw him do. Because be honest, we didn't all think that he was going to be convicted. Had he not been convicted, it would have just been par for the course. So that we had to sit there glued to our televisions, right, or glued to our laptops to see what the verdict was going to be means that there was no justice present, right? There was only accountability. Justice would mean that we knew, irrespective of whether or not he was a police officer, a law enforcement officer, he was going to jail for a murder we all saw him commit with our own eyes, right? And so in thinking about the difference between equity and justice, right? Equity is recognizing that people have particular kinds of needs. Justice, so you can, if you want to be an equitable person, then you could just apply the golden rule, right? And that would get you pretty far, right? You want to be empathic and you want to treat people the way that you want to be treated. But if you want to be interested in justice, not only do you treat people the way that they want to be treated, right? The way that you want to be treated, or the platinum rule, you treat them the way that they want to be treated. What you have to do is commit to identifying, interrogating, and interrupting the systems, right? The institutionalized systems that disallow them from being treated with full human dignity in the first place, right? That's what justice looks like. Justice is interested in changing the environment so that student learning outcomes are no longer predictable by race, right? Or so that the rape culture that permeates our society does not lend its male gaze to folks who identify as women, right? There are so many things that need to happen in order for there to be justice, because remember, justice is not just the absence of injustice. Justice is creating an environment where people can be exactly who they are and treated with dignity, respect, and be allowed to have a full range of human experiences. So a lot of my work in here is around the classroom, right? And so oftentimes we see that Black and brown students are required to check their culture at the door of the classroom in order to be viewed as students full of promise and potential. That's problematic. That's not what radical inclusivity looks like, right? And so we're going to talk more about that as we continue to go on. All right. And this is key, right? And so going back to this idea of radical love, which we'll unpack a little bit more later, if we want to change, we have to be honest. A whitewashed, gentrified recapitulation of Dr. King has only one aim: to make him the author of a twisted gospel that serves to pacify Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color. In this revisionist retelling, Dr. King has been stripped of his radicality in much the same way radical justice work has been and is being stripped of its radicality in order to be palatable to whiteness, right? We see this time and time again. I just recently went to the South. Rachel and I had a conversation about white supremacy. In that conversation, I was talking about racialized tropes. So racialized tropes, real quick background. For Black women, there are three primary archetypes that were birthed out of Blackface minstrelsy, and we get to see made manifest in mass media. There is the sapphire character, which is this kind of tragic mulatto or octoroon, right? You have a Jezebel figure who is thought to be a licentious seductress. Jezebel figure was oftentimes used to justify the rape of Black women by plantation owners. And then you had this mammy figure, and the mammy figure was a larger bone Black woman. Think about Aunt Jemima, right? Or Hattie McDowell in Gone with the Wind, who served as a second mother or a mammy to little white children, right? And so I was making the argument that we had those archetypes are still persistent today in 2023. And I was crazy enough to say, because I've never fully understood white women's fascination with Oprah Winfrey. I said, Oprah Winfrey has been positioned as America's mammy, right? And even if she has, so what? She's laughing all the way to the bank, right? And I'm not talking about Oprah Winfrey the person. I don't know her. I'm talking about the character she plays on her show. And so that got people in their feelings, right? I forgot that Oprah Winfrey is from Mississippi, so she's like their daughter, but it was right. It was hard for people to swallow. And so at the end of the conversation, there was someone who is in DEI work there, a white gentleman, and he came up to me. This is the first time I've given hundreds of talks, friends, and this is the first time this has happened to me. He came up to me afterwards to correct me, right? He had this list of corrective things, and here is where I went awry, right? And as far as, I'm not one to self-aggrandize. As far as scholarship goes, we're not equal, right? It's not like he was a senior scholar, right? He was helping me, right? I don't even know what his scholarship is, but that notwithstanding, right? And he wouldn't let me talk, right? And so there were these pregnant pauses after he would tell me how I was in error, right? Something like, you overestimated the role of racism and capitalism. No, I didn't. I know that I didn't, right? Because racialized capitalism is what birthed white supremacy. White supremacy birthed race, and then race birthed racism, right? We're in the situation that we're in 2023 because racialized capitalism needed to justify itself, right? And that's how it did that, by creating these static categories of whiteness and blackness. And so anyway, the conversation was really interesting. So it wouldn't let me speak, but he just kept wanting to tell me about all the work that he was doing as an advocate for social justice, right? He said, formerly, my grandfather was a plantation owner, but I made a decision to fight back against those things, right? And all these things were coming out. And it was really interesting to me because what I was speaking to struck a chord in him. And that was a chord that he did not want to be struck, but still he in his head was holy and had an office. All the people at his table that worked reported to him were Black. So I can only imagine their lived experiences there in Mississippi, right? But he was really adamant about correcting me because what I said was no longer palatable to him. And then going back to, this is the same meeting where these white liberal, formerly Dixiecratic progressive women are wrestling with whether or not they can even speak to me anymore based on what I said about Oprah Winfrey. And so again, one almost let slip out the reason why that Oprah Winfrey is so appealing to her on a personal level is because she is pallid, but she didn't finish, but we know where that was going. And so if justice work has to be palatable, then it's never going to be successful. I just want to be clear about that. There are things that are going to come up that are going to be uncomfortable. There are things that are going to come up that are going to cause us to question the way that we view the world. Those are all pluses, right? The way that learning works, in order to learn something, you get to a certain threshold where rote memorization can't carry you through. And once you get to that threshold, and then once you overcome that obstacle in between that space, that's where learning takes place. So you want to be in a position where you can struggle. You want to be in a position where you can experience discomfort, because if you're uncomfortable with being uncomfortable, then you're never going to grow. You'll always be the same. And see, the thing is, I'm not a proponent of, some of you all may have heard, we had a book talk recently for this book, The White Educator's Guide to Equity. I'm not a proponent of white guilt. I don't think that you can guilt people into doing equity work. I don't think that you, any more than you can use a fire and brimstone gospel to bring people to God, right? I don't think that those things work, because it's what happens if people are guilted into doing this work is that they then they're working to assuage their guilt. They're not necessarily working. So if it coincides with them doing some good work, then that's awesome. But mainly they just want to feel better about themselves. And so that becomes too insular, too myopic, and it doesn't help create the kind of solidarity that's necessary to shift our current status quo. And so I want to be very, very clear. I'm not trying to guilt anyone. But as with learning anything new, I encourage you to be willing to be uncomfortable, to be willing to understand that Dr. King had more than a dream. He also had a nightmare, right? And I think that Sandra or Carr, someone spoke to this earlier. After all this work, prior to not long before he was assassinated, Dr. King expressed his fear, right? And he was one of the leading integrationists of our time, but he said, I'm afraid that I'm integrating my people into a burning house, right? That burning house was America. All right, so I'm going to go further. Yeah, this is one of the signs I spoke to earlier. Dr. King was a Republican. So we weren't taught after the March on Washington, even though many detractors called it a watered down, federally approved spectacle, the FBI was worried enough to label King the most dangerous Negro in the country. We weren't taught that. But if you hear King talked about 2020, 2021, right, then it would have been very different. And so the spectacle, getting back to Guy Debord's work, is really important, because what has happened, because I don't know if y'all remember this, it depends on how long you've been working through this, but we can say diversity now and it's no problem, right? But there was a time where you couldn't even say equality. You couldn't say diversity. But when these words become palatable, it means they've been co-opted, right? They've been co-opted to the point where the radicality has been completely stripped of them, right? And so that's why I'm not that worried about equity anymore, because that word has been co-opted now and people use it for all kinds of things. But justice is different, right? I know some folks are speaking to what it talks about in the Bible. I want, like in Amos, I want justice to roll like a river, because justice, that I remember when I was in community college, I took a geography class, really difficult class. But I remember something from that class, and it said that there are rivers in the ocean. So why is it important to know that there are rivers in the ocean? You can't see the rivers in the ocean. There's no way to determine how the water is moving. The way that we know that there are rivers in the ocean is because the ground shifts, right? You can't see the movement, but the ground shifts, right? The topography of the ground, you can see, right? Canyons being carved out, and that's how you know that there are rivers in the ocean. And so the spectacle is the opposite. The spectacle is like, look at me. You look at Facebook, right? And you can put the square, I'm against anti-Asian violence. You put a rainbow square. I stand with my LGBTQIA plus brothers and sisters. And that is seen as activism for a lot of people, right? And that is what we would generally, if they're not action, see, that's the thing about social justice work, is always emergent. It's always recursive, but it's always action oriented. It can never just be words, right? And so when it is reduced to just words or kind of displays, then it's been reduced to the spectacle. And the spectacle is not substantive. And the spectacle will never lead to sustainable paradigm shifts in how we see equity and justice. But the spectacle is comfortable. The universal adoration of Dr. King can only be described as a willful decision to mischaracterize his person and work. Detaching Dr. King from his radical socialist left-leaning politics is the only way many Americans who now praise him can do so with what they think is a clear conscience. And they reject things. So there's something that Adam Grant talks about in a book called Think Again. And he talks about how the totalitarian ego, right, this aspect of psychology, is like a little dictator that sits on your shoulder and yells as loud as it can when ideas that challenge your preconceived notions or your idiosyncratic predispositions enter into your consciousness, right? And so it makes it really easy for us to put ourselves, that's why people like echo chambers, right? We put ourselves around people who think like us, who speak like us, who hold the same belief systems as we do. And then we never have to have any type of cognitive dissonance, right? And so that's what has happened. In order for people to be able to say and use, and I would argue misuse, quotes from Dr. King, they have to work to elide the cognitive dissonance that arises from understanding who he really is. And this goes back to the point I'm raising while using James Baldwin as a microcosm. We have to figure out how to tell the truth. If we can't tell the truth about who we are, that this society has a problem that adheres around racialized capitalism and white supremacy working in tandem, right, in a kind of incestuous relationship, because white supremacy is the progeny, right, the offspring of racialized capitalism, but now they both are married, right? And so white supremacy has a kind of parasitic relationship with non-whiteness, right? But it has a symbiotic relationship, a mutually beneficial relationship, racialized capitalism. So justice gentrified, right? And the misappropriation of Dr. King is analogous to the misappropriation of justice that in many ways characterizes performative allyship. Man, this is the thing, y'all. Performative allyship is actually more problematic than just getting out of the way. And we're going to talk a little bit about the 4 A's, right? And so in institutional work, I've been blessed to be able to work with a lot of institutions, a lot of individuals. And so there are 4 A's that I want to speak to that I feel institutions have to be willing to wrestle with if they want to move towards becoming more anti-racist, more equity-centered, and more justice advancing. And so the first A is axioms. And I'm going to go to that slide. I just got a reminder to go to the slide. Y'all have to check out The Devil You Know if you get a chance, right? I'll just read this real quick. Performative activism is activism done to increase one's social capital rather than one's devotion to a cause. Many corporations fall into this category. I talked about this, right? To gain positive, you guys got the word. Social justice work today, it's co-opting, it's performative. There's little to no investment. Listen, y'all, it's not really social justice if it's not itemized and there are dollar amounts in the budget. And I saw an article the other day. I have not vetted it thoroughly, but what it showed is that 82% of chief DEI officers in the United States are folks who are racialized as white. And so let's talk about what we're up against. All right, real quick. Dr. King dreamed that this country could one day realize this potential without ever losing sight of reality. The inescapable reality is that this country is and always has been predicated on a racialized value gap. And the value gap is easy to understand. You have whiteness on one side, considered to be valuable, right? If I had time, I would talk about how we can unpack that through a Marxist lens, how whiteness has been transmogrified into a kind of universal equivalent. But let's suffice it to say for now, you have whiteness on one end, and that's where value is, and blackness is on the other end of the continuum, which has no value. And then there's a pigmentocratic kind of valuation, right, based on pigment or melanin, pigmentocratic valuation that follows that continuum. And that's the value gap. In any civilized society, it's every citizen's responsibility to obey just laws, but at the same time, it's every citizen's responsibility to disobey unjust laws, right? So social justice work asks some serious questions. Are you ready to assume that positionality? Here's the value gap. In this country, there is a racialized value gap that undergirds our national ethos as well as the very structure of our society. This gap is predicated on the belief in concomitant policies that reminds us that that white lives are more valuable than non-white lives. You can see Khalif Browder, who after this malfeasance of justice took his own life because he could not reconcile what had taken place. Khalif Browder allegedly stole a backpack at 16. He spent 3 years in Rikers Island without a trial and then later committed suicide. Riley Williams stole a laptop from Speaker Pelosi's office and tried selling it to the Russians. She was released to her mother. There are two, and this is from the January 6th insurrection. There are two justice systems in America. All right, so here are the 4 A's. So axioms are things like, so if I ask y'all real quick, and you can put it in the chat, what are the things that are called that you put in your ear, right? These things, you're not supposed to put them in there, but I do it anyway because I like the way it feels, but you're not really supposed to. Most folks would say Q-tips, right? Like Olden said Q-tips, but they're actually called cotton swabs. Q-tip is the brand that controls the lion's share of the market, right? Or we can say an AR-15. Everybody's heard of an AR-15. What does the AR and AR-15 stand for? I'll give you a hint. It's not assault rifle, right? It stands for Armalite rifle, and that's the 15th version. So those things are axioms, right? Things that we consider to be unquestionably true, but upon scrutiny, maybe they don't hold up. But those are innocuous, right? But there are axioms that hold that, for example, Black men aren't good at math, or Black men are prone to criminality, right? And I'll just take that one up real quick, right? And so what in the new Jim Crow, I can't think of her name right now. I'd say it all the time, and it'll come to me as soon as it's over. The author talks about how this conflation between Black men and criminality has been written juridically into our system. Michelle Alexander, thank you, Sandra, has been written into our system juridically. But she says when you control for joblessness, the rate of violent crime between Black men and white men is actually identical, right? And so it just the reality is that Black men are disproportionately jobless, and part of that can be if you want to look for more on that, you can look at Diva Prager's work at Harvard, and she talks about how white men with a criminal record are more likely to get a call back for a job than Black men with no criminal record and a college degree, right? And so those are axioms. If axioms go unquestioned, right? Axioms generally adhere around deficit model thinking, right? Or subtractive thinking. If axioms go unquestioned, they become ambivalence. Ambivalence is analogous to sitting on a fence, right? And what happens if you sit on a fence is that, you say, well, can you get down Black Lives Matter message, not necessarily the organization. Well, I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about that. What happens is the fence is an obstacle. And if you're on the fence becomes more difficult to move, right? So it's better to just get off the fence and get out the way if you're not going to participate in tearing it down. And so there's a linear process that's going on because that ambivalence leads to apathy, right? So as a rhetorician, I spent a lot of time talking about the rhetorical triangle, right? Pathos is emotionality. To be apathetic means to have no feeling, right? And so if that ambivalence goes unchecked individually, But especially institutionally, you can have an institution that's apathetic, right? And so now the problems of people who are being underserved are no longer your problems, they're their problems, right? And then if apathy goes unchecked, it leads to antipathy, right? And so this is an anti-feeling. This is a feeling that is against. So antipathy, right? And you can have an institutionalized antipathy, and antipathy is characterized by what's called a recriminatory strategy, right? So it's blaming the victim for speaking to the way that they're mistreated, right? And we see this time and time again, right? We can see this in any asymmetrical power relationship. And so those are the 4 A's, and we'll spend time unpacking those more at another time, or you can check them out. Like I said, I don't get any money if y'all buy this book. I'm just telling you the stuff is in the book. All right. In cases, white allies began to center their own maltreatment while protesting rather than the fundamental issue at hand, the treatment of Black people throughout their lives. And this is what performative allyship or activism almost always devolves into, right? This is Dr. King's view of racism, and there are many ways to describe racism. Not everybody can be racist. Racism is a power structure, but Dr. King says racism is a philosophy based on a contempt for life. It is the arrogant assertion that one race is the center of value and the object of devotion before which other races must deal in submission, right? So that's the way to look at it. That's my own definition from my first book. We talked about this. And so I want to get to this point, truth telling. If we hope to achieve educational equity and justice, we must tell the truth. The truth is that for poor ethno-racially minoritized students living in a country that normalizes racialized macrostructural inequity, albeit while denying its existence, right? This kind of gaslighting or race lighting is soul crushing, spiritually deadening, and potentially fatal. So if we want to do this work, right, we have to understand Dr. King as a microcosm of this work. We have to tell the truth about who he was, and we also have to tell the truth about who we are as institutions and as a country if we want to be able to do this work in earnest. All right, and so I'm going to end here. The reckoning. All right. So like James Baldwin argued, this country's ethos positions it as a country that is wholly invested in democracy and justice, and as such, any deviation from that aim can be summarily dismissed as a bump on the road to a more perfect union. In many ways, institutions of higher learning take this same approach. This is a revisionist history that functions to exculpate the institutionalized policies, practices, procedures, and pedagogies that have historically and systematically penalized, it's a lot of P's, sorry for the alliteration, y'all, poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. If we want to make real change, if we want to be equity advancing, we have to confront the lies that have become axiomatic within our institutions. And then I love this quote from James Baldwin, right? Things seem bleak, but it's not all over. Not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. If one refuses abdication, one begins again. And so with that, thank you all. And here's a question for y'all. And then how can GGU honor Dr. Martin Luther King's radical legacy in its own DEIB work? And so I'm going to pass it back to Rachel to figure out what's happening next.
You could stop sharing if you like. So we're going to open up the next 20 minutes for a Q&A from the audience, or for anyone to be able to respond or comment on the presentation. So you can be free to unmute if you'd like to ask a question, or drop questions in the chat, and then I can feed those to him.
I was talking my face off, y'all. I know that was a lot of information. I'll make my contact information available if y'all want to push back on some things, or you want to get more clarification. I am always open to have those conversations. So I'll put my email in the chat now.
Excellent presentation, and I appreciated the breadth and depth. Your knowledge integrated with the knowledge and experience that we are somewhat familiar with. You brought a great deal of clarity. I'm very interested in your opinion with what's going on in education as we are banning books and adjusting curriculum and defaming critical race theory. I know you have thoughts.
Oh, for sure. So it's really interesting, but it all adheres around who gets to have the full range of human experiences, right? So this is a gross oversimplification, but for those of you who are not familiar with critical race theory, there are 5 primary components, right? Intelligence, convergence, and whiteness as normal. But what I want to say is, just to help you all think through it in this moment, it's like if you've ever been in a car accident, right? If you've been in a car accident and both parties are still there and a law enforcement officer shows up, who do they speak to? They speak to both parties because they're trying to get an accurate story about what happened so that they can make some level of a qualified kind of analytical conclusion. And so the reason we need critical race theory is because there's already race theory. Absent critical race theory, the theory, the history that we get is a white supremacist history that privileges whiteness over all else. So if there's not a counterpoint to that, that's the only story you'll receive. And so there's an adage, I believe it's a Kenyan adage that says, you never let the lion tell the giraffe story. Why, right? Critical race theory is creating space for the giraffe to tell its own story, right? Of terror and of fear and all these things that were going on. And so with regard to banning books, it's not going to work. That's the thing that's so incredulous to me. It's only about, for Ron DeSantis and folks of that ilk, it's only to fatten their political coffers so he can make a run for president. Because what's going to happen is that kids who could not care less about these books, go tell a teenager they can't do something, right? Go tell a 10-year-old that you can't do this thing. That's exactly what they're going to do. And so what's going to happen is that you're going to have a wave of folks in the South who are reading, right? And this may be overly optimistic, but I believe it to be true, who are going to be reading books that they previously had no interest in. So it's going to backfire, but it's not going to matter for his political aspirations. The reason why we talk about AR-15s, obviously AR-15s are destructive, right? But the reason why you hear so much about it on the left is so that it can make people afraid. Politics is all about fear mongering. If I can make you afraid, then you'll give me money to make your fear go away, right? And so then that fattens my coffers. CRT is being used as a kind of dog whistle to scare people because, listen, I went to UC Berkeley, right? I studied with some of the people who are authors of some of this work, right? I'm still learning how to speak to it. These folks in these K-12 schools they're not doing critical race theory, right? They're not. Right? Because it's a graduate level course of studies that you have to have some training in. But if I can make you afraid that that's happening, right, then you'll give me some money to make it go away. And Deborah, one more thing, and I touched on this briefly, it's all about who gets to be comforted, right? Because if you hear about millennials, right, or whatever generation this is now, people are always talking from previous generations how soft they are. Right. And especially people on the right, where we believe this kind of rugged individualism is our national ethos. But if you have a law that says don't make me feel bad, it's kind of soft by their own definition. So it's a conundrum, but it doesn't matter because it's a capitalist society and it feeds their coffers. Right. So that's ultimately what it is. They're not afraid of the books. They're not afraid that people are teaching it. But if they can make people afraid of it, people will pay them to make it go away.
So we have a question here in the chat from Natalie. For individuals without economic resources to redirect, what alternatives do you recommend for those who have participated in performative social justice acts?
Reflection is key. You don't want to continue to be in that space. So John Dewey, who was America's foremost educational philosopher, argues that y'all have all heard this saying before. I can look at Deborah and Pam, Nicole, my folks here, right? I know y'all heard this before. Experience is the best teacher. But John Dewey said, no, that's not true. Experience is not the best teacher. He says, you don't actually learn until you reflect on your experiences, right? So reflection is key. And I want to draw a very clear line of delineation between introspection and reflection, right? So folks who have been racialized as white who begin to do this work oftentimes get introspective. And they get introspective to the point where it leads to a kind of paralysis and they can't move forward. Reflectivity is different from introspection. Introspection is taking yourself apart piecemeal and continuously going over problematic things that you've done. Now, if you've done something problematic, then I encourage you to apply a restorative justice model to make amends. But you always have to be future facing. So how is my making amends for this going to create a way for me to move forward in solidarity with other people who are interested in doing this work, right? Don't be introspective. Don't spend time wallowing in guilt, right? If you did something, if you caused harm, address that harm, but address the harm in a way that creates space for you to continue to move. I'm not perfect. I mess up. Everybody messes up, right? And so you have to be willing to be vulnerable and to display radical humility and say that I'm sorry and I made a mistake. I'm invested in restoring our relationship, and I'm invested in continuing forward in this work. And that would be my encouragement to everyone, irrespective of how old you are, how long you've been doing this.
I have a question here from Norris. I really enjoyed your talk. I read a book back in 1977, which stated every generation prides itself on its achievements and its cruelties. Each seeks to determine who will be sacrificed for whom. My guess is the book was written more than 10 years before I read it, and the problem continues to exist. And the focus is still, how do we prevent from being the sacrificial lamb? Again, thank you for peeling back the layer of BS.
That's awesome. That's an awesome question. I really like that. I think that what we have to figure out is, so let me tell you something. This is what I believe to be true, right? And we've seen it. And I can point you to historical examples of this, even contemporary examples of this. Solidarity, real cross-racial solidarity, right? Cross-class solidarity is unstoppable. It changes. Now we know, right, the work that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King catalyzed, and there were so many other folks who were working to change civil rights legislation. I mean, we know who it actually benefited the most, right? White women, right? That's not happenstantial, right? That's the reality. But there was some elements of a rising tide could momentarily lift all boats too, right? But the reality is that just because things are a certain way doesn't mean they have to remain that way. And so what we have to, Heather McGhee has a really good book on this called The Sum of Us, where she talks about the solidarity dividend. And there's a solidarity dividend that we can catalyze together, because if we think about what Maya Angelou said, right? Maya Angelou said this. She said, when you know better, what happens? You do better. Right? If you know better, you do better. So the only real problem that I have with anyone in this work is that if you know better and you're refusing to do better, now there's a problem. Now you need to be helped. And it could be that you're too hurt to move forward, but then you have to be willing to be transparent about that. Right? And so there's work that we can do, and we have to do it together. No one person can shift this monster.
Henry, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, Jeremiah, higher education, I think in general, likes to think of itself as a sector as kind of more enlightened than the rest of society.
That's mistake number one, but go ahead.
Yes. And yet, if you look at the state of society or the world, you could easily draw the conclusion that education, whether higher education or K-12 education, is clearly not getting something figured out. And so how would you suggest not just perhaps higher education, but a GGU kind of understand what our responsibility, and I'm going to add the word opportunity is?
Yeah, I like that.
To lead in a way that isn't just about DEI, but it's about education is supposed to make people better than they are without that knowledge.
Right.
And yet, despite all the colleges and universities in America and around the world, society is clearly struggling mightily, not just in the US, but abroad. So I'd love for you to just kind of opine for a minute on that.
Sure. So I think that a quality education should be metacognitive. What does that mean? Any quality education should help you think about the way that you think. It shouldn't tell you what to think, but it should help you think about the way that you think about problems in society and how you can enter into spaces and make a difference, right? So Rachel and I have 5 beautiful boys, right? The oldest 13, youngest is 3. We got all the ages in the middle. For these young men, I want them to figure out how they can, and always be trying to figure out how they can contribute to a positive, socially just society. For me, that's what a quality education. I don't care if you get straight A's, and it's only for you, right? All the work needs to be done in community if we want these things to change. And I think education needs to make that shift. The problem with higher education is that higher education is trying to overlay these kind of neoliberal capitalist efficiency models on something that's supposed to be organic, right? Educational enterprises like GGU should be organisms, but instead you function as an organization. So then what happens is these kind of opportunities to experience life, to experience a kind of radically humanizing positionality are supplanted by transaction, right? there are these transactional things that take the place of real human experiences. And so what happens is the human component is now missing, right? Because everything has been transactionalized. And then there's something I think that's important to think about that Cornel West argues. He says that we are currently, right, we can point to all these really concrete things, but what's happening is that this country is in a spiritual blackout. We're in a spiritual blackout precisely because the truth has been replaced by manipulation, right? And so what is happening is that students are being manipulated in a way, right? Hear me out. So that we can then say, look what we did. Everything has been reduced into a commodity, right? We've commoditized our students. We've commoditized FTE, right? Full-time enrollment. We've commoditized all these things when we need to humanize these things. And so I know I'm not getting directly to it, but what I want to speak to with regard to GGU and to, you know, higher education writ large is that we have to figure out how to humanize the experiences that our students are afforded while under our care. Because if we continue to transactionalize it, we're going to continue to see the same things over and over and over again. And you're just going to have people who are accustomed to and only know how to interface with other people based on transactional things. And when there's transaction, there's no space for radical love. And radical love is what actually changes people and changes institutions and will change this society.
Thanks, Jeremiah.
Absolutely.
So there was a comment in the chat about, you know, folks in leadership being absent in this particular event. And the question is, you know, what can we do, or what have you seen work? I'm laughing because I work with you. What have you seen work as far as getting leadership and those in, you know, the right positions to be a part of these conversations and invested in these type of initiatives in higher education?
So, Jeremiah, if I can just quickly, I certainly want to call out the leaders who are here as well. Dean Haney, thank you. I don't have all of the people on the screen. Carrie Ann Quick, Dean Quick. And I know that my fellow executive team members, the president had a dinner, unfortunately, and there were some other things going on, but without question, I think ensuring that leadership is demonstrating what we want our community to be about is critical.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that you all have to bring to.
Yes, Dean Van Cleve as well. Thank you.
What's up? Good to see you, Dean Van Cleve. I think that's important for y'all to bring that to the fore and ask those questions, right? There have to be venues for you all to ask those questions. And then we you know, doesn't have to be me, but then there needs to be some leadership, some executive leadership specific conversations, right? We would love to see them in the space, but sometimes, and I'm not accusing anybody of this, but sometimes what happens is in social justice spaces is we get too preoccupied with who's not there. And so it makes it hard for us to move forward. Of course, we want our leadership to be here, but you got a lot of people here, right? And so aspects of social justice work are kind of predicated on this idea of guerrilla warfare, right? You talk Che Guevara was a proponent of this. You fight where you are, right? This is where you are right now. This is your sphere of influence, right? You fight where you are. Eventually, what will happen is that solidarity, that wave of solidarity will become so strong that they either need to get with it or get out of the way, right? And that's what happens. And sometimes, you know, there's a saying, you got to be careful what you ask for. You get enough leadership folks in here and then they start to tell you what you can't really do, right? Well, we can't do that. The budget doesn't allow for that. Well, we should do that, but we don't, traditionally, we've never done that. I think that this space can be a sacred space for now so that you can continue to build momentum, because it may be, right, fortuitous or even serendipitous that they're not here at this point, right?
Let me also acknowledge one of our Board of Trustee members, Deborah Plusha Moore. Thank you, not just for your presence, but more importantly for what you've shared and your leadership as a member of the board that leads this institution.
I'm honored to be here and honored to be with the GGU community as we embrace knowledge and beauty and truth. And John Dewey, well said, well done. Loved it.
Awesome. So y'all gonna be all right. You got Deborah. You're gonna be all right. Deborah's not gonna let them act too crazy. So I have faith in that.
As we are wrapping up, I also want to acknowledge all of our alumni who have joined us this evening. I would love if you guys want to use the reaction symbol and raise your hand for just a moment. I'd love to just so we can kind of visually see and acknowledge our alumni who have chosen to join. Thank you, because you are the legacy of this institution. And so for all of you who have joined this evening, we really appreciate seeing you, and we want you to continue to be seen. So thank you to our faculty, to our staff, and to our students who have participated. I want to lift all of you up as well. I know some of you may be in the midst of studying for exams right now, but taking this time to be reminded of the importance beyond classwork, beyond perhaps what's right in front of you, of how you can use your knowledge beyond is important as well. And I want also to end by really thanking Rachel and Jeremiah Sims for being so committed, not just to this work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, but being as committed as they are to this institution. Neither one of them, Rachel or Jeremiah, are graduates of this institution, but they have come to fully believe in both the history and legacy of this institution, as well as the promise of Golden Gate, particularly right now as higher education as a sector deals with lots of significant challenges. Their commitment, as they demonstrate consistently, is something I appreciate and want to lift up as well. Jeremiah, I would not at all steal your thunder by taking the last word, so I will leave you with the last word, sir.
Oh, I'll just say this. Y'all can do this work. You can do it, right? But you have to be willing, right? The journey of 1,000,000 miles starts with just one step. You have to be willing to take that step. You have to be willing to embrace discomfort, right? Professor Joe Bowler at Stanford wrote a book called Limitless Minds. And in that book, she talked about how you can totally rewire your brain in 3 weeks, right? You can develop something called an anti-racist growth mindset, trademark rooted in love. You can develop an anti-racist growth mindset, but you have to be willing to start. And if you're in a place where you're scared to start, or you need a gentle, loving push to start, then just email me. I put my information there, and we can certainly have a conversation about it, because I want to see y'all win, because when you win, your students will win. And when your students win, the society will win. So I'm all for it. And I'm here as a resource. Y'all don't need me. You can do it alone, but just know that I'm here. And I'm really excited to hear about what you all continue to do moving forward as you make GGU, because your history is incredible. Almost everybody else has the opposite history. They were super problematic for a long time, and now they're trying to shift. Y'all have been doing really, like, you had some of the first Black deans, right? Some of the first Black admits to law school. All kind of wonderful things have taken place at GGU, right? But you can't rest on your laurels, right? You got to keep moving forward. And now is the time. And so y'all were made for a time such as this. I believe that you will do amazing things, and I'm here to applaud and cheer you on. So thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to build community with y'all. Thoroughly enjoyed it.